everybody. Once again, this is Micah Lieberman with Scope, both in the US and Europe, and with Clinico. Very active, of course, in the clinical research community. And we have these great interviews with friends from industry and academia and other places. We just talk about issues that we think are interesting to you. And today's a special one because we've also been doing a series more on a subset of topics related to sustainability in pharma and in clinical trials. And we have a whole workshop on that at Scope in the US and Europe. Big topic. Today, we're going to broaden it a bit. So you'll recognize Michael Cohen because we've been doing these together. Thank you, Michael. And then, Michael, introduce yourself really quick before I bring on our special guest to this week's TV show.
Thank you, Micah. So Michael Cohen, Senior Director, I lead environmental sustainability for PPD, the clinical research business for Thermo Fisher Scientific.
Yep, big supplier, long supply chains, a lot of clients, global impact. So it's really interesting. I like your backdrop. Dr. Amy Booth is our special guest. So she's an Oxford-based kind of climate researcher, but that only says a little bit. Amy, tell people how you ended up in this phone call with me and what you do. You have many titles.
I do have many titles. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be on here. So as you mentioned, my name is Amy. I am actually a clinician from South Africa, but I have turned climate researcher and I'm based at Oxford at the moment. And at the moment, I'm researching how we can decarbonize the pharmaceutical industry.
That's a big ask. It's a big industry. That's cool. Okay. Now everybody knows how you ended up here, because originally we were talking about, I think in a few interviews that Michael and I did, we were really focused on decarbonizing clinical trials. That piece. Let's broaden it out. Talk a little bit about your research. Tell us kind of some of the things about pharmaceuticals in the environment. Let's start broad, then we'll get down a little narrower.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to maybe broaden it even more and talk about healthcare as a whole, because that's obviously where the pharmaceutical industry sits into. And so we know that healthcare has a massive environmental impact spanning carbon footprint. So about 5% of global emissions comes from healthcare. Huge amounts of waste. We saw that during the COVID pandemic, for example, and obviously pharmaceuticals and chemicals that leak into the environment. Why the pharmaceutical industry is so important in this is that the bulk of those emissions, for example, a lot of the pharmaceuticals that leak into the environment, that takes place within healthcare supply chains, that is pharmaceutical companies and their own suppliers. And so if we look at those environmental impacts, we can see that the pharmaceutical industry itself has a massive carbon footprint. But as you mentioned, there's this additional environmental impact that we call pharmaceuticals in the environment. And so what that means is that we've got residues that leak into our environmental sources, either when we prescribe them to patients and they get excreted out, but also during the manufacturing phase. And those residues wreak absolute havoc in our ecosystems. We know about 900 plus pharmaceutical residues exist in our ecosystems at the moment. They cause things like feminization of fish. They've wiped out entire populations like the Southeast Asia vulture, for example, and they contribute to antimicrobial resistance, which is obviously pertinent to human health. And so that's an additional environmental factor that I think we need to consider in these conversations.
It's big. It's big. Okay, so Michael, you could jump in, but I have two questions. And so I don't want to get into politics, but this is a tough one. Looking at pharmaceutical residues. Is that something that the industry needs to address on its own, or does this have to come from a regulatory position, from a governmental level to say, you guys, let's all work together and say, let's improve that? How do you tackle something like that? We have a long history with this. I mean, look at Rachel Carson's book. You know, how long ago was that where we started to learn about pesticides? We didn't want to admit the truth because we didn't want to slow things down. So that's a big thing. Pharmaceutical residues, the fact that 5% of global emissions are from healthcare, pharma inside of that as a whole, I don't think people realize that. So we're going to continue our research. We're going to continue being patients and being grateful for this incredible care we get. So how do you start doing this? Once you're doing your research on what is the impact, where is it coming from? You start gaining those insights, then what? Is it a policy path? Is it a negotiating from an industry collaborative? I don't know. What's next?
Yeah, good question. I think it needs to happen from across all of those levels. So absolutely there's a space for regulation around this, and it's sorely lacking. I do also think that the industry can do a lot in their own manufacturing processes, and some are. So installing, for example, wastewater systems that help to filter out these residues. The technology there is still quite in its infancy. So we do need, for example, engineers to come on board to help solve this issue as well. At the healthcare level, I think we can tackle it by, for example, reducing unnecessary prescriptions or encouraging patients to take their whole course of pharmaceuticals and not just chuck them down the drain, for example. There's also this wider need for other industries to get involved, because pharmaceuticals don't just leak in from healthcare, they also leak in from agriculture and aquaculture and other industries as well. And that's where this sort of One Health approach comes in with action across the different industries. So I think absolutely there's a need for regulation and policy, but there's also action needed from a whole host of other stakeholders.
Is like looking at this, there's obviously a huge cost to society. We've learned this, right? There's a usage fee, right? We all use the kind of the tragedy of the commons, right? We're all using shared resources in a way, water, air. So if we quantify this and we come back and industry is aware of it, there also has to be a way for them, and I'm putting it just saying the word industry, just, these for-profit enterprises that have to run on margins, keep people employed, blah, blah, blah. Has it come up in your work where you're saying, here's why it makes sense, not just because we need to do this at a societal level, but here's also how you could implement this, or why you should implement this for cost savings, for efficiency, for better business. I'm not saying these people don't care. They do, but you have to speak their language as well. So can you expand on that a little bit, Amy, and like what you've learned in your research and with your conversations with all of these stakeholders?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think in your previous question, you touched on the stick. Do we need regulation around this? But there's absolutely a carrot as well. And so I think some of the key drivers, and I'll speak broadly around environmental impacts, not just pharmaceuticals and the environment, but two of the sort of key drivers in this space are coming from investors who are increasingly looking at what companies are doing around ESG, how they're reducing their wider environmental impact. And that's been a critical driver. And then the second one is consumers, and specifically health systems. What are they demanding from their pharmaceutical suppliers? And so I'm based in the UK, and the NHS is obviously a massive purchasing power. And they have recently rolled out their NHS Supplier Roadmap, which requests suppliers to align with their sustainability goals. And so I think that is a really key financial driver as well. But you also mentioned things around financial savings from efficiency. And so absolutely, if you can streamline some of these processes, I think you can have financial costs and environmental costs, or savings rather, and then additionally the social health impact that you benefit downstream as well.
And
Dr. Booth,
go ahead, Michael.
As you say, Dr. Booth, what role do you think doctors have to play in this, right? As a physician, prescribing patterns, all of those things. Obviously, the NHS has a very strong hand in this, but in the US, we don't have the same kind of guiding, environmentally focused healthcare system in the same way, for example. So where do you see doctors globally kind of fitting into this problem?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think a lot of it comes down to demand for pharmaceuticals, and that really happens at the point of care. So if doctors are prescribing these drugs, then there's going to be a need for them. And absolutely, if we need the drugs to improve patient outcomes, I think that's essential. But what we're seeing quite sporadically, but it's definitely growing, is doctors looking more at the environmental impact when prescribing. So actually taking that into consideration when choosing which drug to prescribe. And I think that will have potential upstream impact on the industry, but also looking more around prevention and health promotion, and do we need to prescribe this drug in the first place? And so once I think you get that sort of mass advocacy and demand from the healthcare prescriber point of view, I think you'll then see the procurement tagging along and the upstream industry meeting those demands as well.
Yeah, procurement's a good word to use in all of these things we're talking about. Ultimately, and Michael, this is a little bit for you. Thermo Fisher, PPD, global business. What you mentioned, Amy, about the NHS supplier roadmap. That's an enormous, I don't know, is that a carrot and a stick? Maybe it's both, right? Because they're ultimately the ultimate buyer, right? And so Europe is ahead on this. So maybe that's also some of where this is going to come from is regulatory, but also saying, hey, we are a buyer, we're a customer, and this is what we need. Michael, has that impacted Thermo Fisher, PPD's business, and some of your work? That one example, then NHS's supplier roadmap. I know as an industry, you guys are, as a company, you're forward looking, but that's one example where you're like, oh, now AZ in the UK is telling us we must do X, Y, and Z. So has it impacted you?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think the Sustainable Markets Initiative a few years ago came out with a supplier scorecard, sort of similar in mindset to the NHS roadmap that Dr. Booth is mentioning, which lays out, specific kind of criteria that they're looking for from suppliers. We've been answering questions about sustainability, SBTI goals, et cetera, for a year plus on RFPs, RFIs, bid defenses, et cetera. I plot the RFPs and RFIs that include this, and it's a hockey stick type of map,
Okay.
right? I mean, it's only increasing in terms of the quantity of sponsors that are asking about these types of areas. So it's only going up. We obviously are also have our own suppliers, as you've mentioned. So we're, starting to have those same kinds of conversations with our suppliers as well. We have a target of hitting 90% of our suppliers by spend by 2027 to have set science-based targets as well. So I think, we both have that same problem from a procurement perspective, and also are addressing that problem, as a supplier creating scope 3 emissions for our sponsors. I think the recent open letter from the Sustainable Markets Initiative that was signed by 7 predominantly European pharma companies, I think further advanced this issue, and it further advances the call for both more, I'd say, more transparency, but also more efforts in innovation and pilots to identify ways that we can reduce the waste, reduce the emissions, most centrally for around clinical trials, but also in general with the work that we are doing for pharma.
All right, this is good, you guys. We're talking about carrots, sticks, collaboration. There is progress. It's never fast enough. I am excited. I think in our comments below, Michael, if you could find that letter, the open letter, let's post a link to that. We could put it on Clinico too. We're happy to post it and distribute it. I think it's interesting. Everybody's got to get involved, whether you're a mid-sized CRO, a big CRO, whether you're working in procurement or whether you're working in strategy, forwards, all of this is going to impact you. And the sooner you embrace it, the better. And the more you are involved in the conversation, the better. And then Dr. Booth, I'm curious also, like when people from pharma come, I think it depends who they are. Obviously, if they come to you with a job title like Michael's, I think you're speaking the same language. But I think some folks are behind the curve and they probably want to know more and what it means to them. So I don't know. I don't have a clear question, but I think we need to post something below in our comments, some of your research, so we can give people some cliff notes if that's where they are in their journey, or some actionable items if that's where they are in their journey. So I think I'm going to ask you both for that, and we'll keep going. Dr. Booth, are you feeling optimistic?
Oh, good question. I think I go through peaks and troughs of optimism.
Okay.
But after this conversation, I think definitely speaking to like-minded people always makes me optimistic.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you both for hanging out, having this discussion. We'll keep them going, and we'll try to post some things, whether to the Clinico, to the Commons. We'll post them there or in the comments themselves, both work. We want everybody to be involved. We want everybody to be involved. So Dr. Amy Booth, Michael Cohen, Micah Lieberman signing out. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.